Thanks so much, Miriam. That was really heartwarming and very, very well done. So our next speaker, and then we'll take a break after this, and we'll reduce the time for the panel at the end to make up. And so our next speaker, Katya Smyth, is doing really amazing work. She's the founder and CEO of the Full Frame Initiative. We were really drawn to this because she's really bringing together that intersection of poverty and violence and the other oppressions that we're talking about this afternoon. Katya has done a lot of work in Massachusetts with the On Rise, Inc., an organization supporting homeless women so that we're poorly served by mainstream organizations. She's a research affiliate with MIT's Community Innovators Lab and a research fellow at Malcolm Winter Center for Social Policy at Harvard. We're so happy to have her today to talk to us about the Full Frame Initiative and her exciting and innovative work around the intersection of poverty and violence. Let's give a warm Idaho welcome to Katya.
Thank you. I'm not going to step up on the podium because I'm a wanderer and I will fall off. So, excuse me while I move the podium. Thingamajiggy. So you thought we were all really tall? We're not really all that tall. Well, thank you for having me here. I have to admit, this is my first time as an adult in Boise, but I actually took a picture from the airport because you have probably the best view from an airport, and I've been seeing a lot of airports lately, so I sent that home. But in all seriousness, thank you for having me. It's really great to be here, and I'm really excited to build on so many of the themes that we've been hearing about through the day. Let me start with an invitation that I'm going to frame it as an invitation at the beginning, and by the end, I hope that it will make sense if I turn it back into a challenge. My invitation to us all is to take on the really revolutionary act of redefining success, not as the reduction or elimination of violence or danger, or even the safety of survivors, but actually of well-being for adult survivors, for their children, and for the people who perpetrate violence. So I want to start, is this the clicker? Really? Sorry, you'll discover that this is a low mastery moment. Uh-oh. Okay. I know there are pens at your table. Don't pretend they're not. Please take a pen and find a scrap of paper. I want you on that piece of paper, please, to write down 5 ways you define yourself. Mother, professional, daughter, immigrant, hard worker, not hard worker. You're all hard workers here, right? 5. Cross one out. Cross out the one that's least important to you. Now cross off another one, please. Do it. One more. You should have 2. And one more, so you have 1. What if all that anybody knew about you or cared about you was through that lens? Whatever that one lens is that you're left with. What if that were your whole identity? What assumptions would people make about you? And what wouldn't they see about you? Right? So the point of this, obviously, is that we all are a combination of many identities and experiences. And as Jackie said, we aren't mothers on Thursdays and workers on Mondays and you know, caretaking children on Saturdays and a bunch of other. We don't switch off like that. We are all constantly holding multiple truths about ourselves. And our pathways to well-being flow through these multiple identities, not through just one. When we are only seen as, when we only see the survivor in people, whether that's the survivor of violence or a survivor of cancer, we miss the whole person. When we see only the broken, we miss the solution. For those of us who are deep in frontline crisis work, when we only see the crisis, we often miss the transformation of ourselves and of other people. And when we only see the services that we provide, that we refer to, that those we care about count on, we miss the community that's going to hold people long after we're gone. We actually all define ourselves less by the individual things that we have written down on these lists, but actually at the intersection of them, of race and gender and ethnicity and experiences, good and bad, and relationships and talents and opportunities. In documentary filmmaking, there's a concept called full frame. Any filmmakers here? I found the group that's not represented. Amazing. Okay, so there's a concept called full frame. To show who a person is, we need to not just focus on that person's head and do sort of the talking head thing. We've all seen sort of documentaries about people that are like that, right? But not even just follow somebody around with a camera. We need to pull the lens all the way back and fill the frame of our attention with that person and how that person shapes and is shaped by relationships and community and context. And the way all of these pieces come to inform each other. And the name of the Full Frame Initiative comes from our belief that we are not going to truly address poverty or violence unless we pull the frame all the way back and fill the frame of our attention, not just with any one issue, not just even with a combination of issues, but with all the strengths and powers that already exist in community. And with the multiple identities that people bring to us beyond being a survivor. Audre Lorde wrote, if I didn't find myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies of me and eaten alive. And when we reduce ourselves or are reduced by others to one identity, that's what often happens. We're inadvertently crunched. Our challenge is to see each other and those we advocate for and with and among in the full frame of our lives, because that's the only way that we keep from doing this to the people that we care about. A full frame approach to our work, whether we're in prevention or intervention or community work or wherever, or medicine or wherever we are, it's a way of understanding the dance of people and place, individuals and community, history and context. And when we do, we understand something really important. We understand how the snap judgments and inferences that first of all, we're all wired to make. It's just part of our survival as a species, is to take in information and make judgments like this, and especially if there's trauma, and especially if we feel like safety is an issue. We heard about that this morning, right? We have to draw conclusions quickly, right? And our training, especially if we're in crisis services, is to do that even more. Not just about our own situation, but about the situation of the person sitting in front of us, because they're coming to us because there's violence. They're coming to us because there's in crisis, right? We've been trained to make these. A full frame approach is a way of taking in that information, yes, but in taking a step back just enough so that we're really aware that what is that person in front of us, that moment, that incident, that is not indicative of the whole. That all of us live lives and have relationships that are masses of contradictions and that are complicated and messy. So let me tell you a story. That's my mom. I want to tell you a story about my mom. About 15 years ago, my mom was diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer. It was in her lungs and in her bones. My mom was a fighter, and she also was a scientist, and so she did a lot of research, and she figured out what she needed to do, and she got hooked up with the oncologist, and she dove into fighting that beast, and that was her mission. She was not going to let this thing get her. She took early retirement. She stopped singing in the choir because it interfered with some of her other activities. She did the mindfulness and the meditation and the visualization of zapping the cells out of her bloodstream and her lymph system, and she did all that stuff, and she did cancer support groups, and she did all of the stuff, and she changed her diet, and she'd been healthy, but now she was crazy healthy, and she was doing everything she should. And she became, I think, clinically depressed. Not because she had metastatic cancer, but because she was becoming someone who was fighting metastatic cancer. But when she stopped denying the other parts of herself, and she went back to singing in the chorus that she'd sung in since I was a little kid, and doing beginner Zumba, which she never graduated from after many years, and I inherited my bad balance from a mother who tried really hard to do Tai Chi and couldn't. Did all these things that were good for her, but that weren't directly about fighting the cancer, and went back out to lunch with her friends and started mentoring other science teachers again as she had before, and even got back in touch with her graduate students. She was still religious about her chemotherapy and her cancer and her support networks and those other things, but it wasn't who she was. And you know what? My mother, who'd been given maybe a year to live, lived 10 years. Now, was it just because of that? I don't know. But I'm absolutely certain that if she and everyone around her had continued to just see her primarily as someone who was fighting cancer, she would have been dead in a year. This looks awfully like Jackie's picture. We'll have to talk. This is not intersectionality. This is someone who may have multiple identities that are foisted on them by our systems, all against a backdrop of poverty, violence, and trauma. That's not an intersectionality. That's not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about multiple identities. That's just an unholy mess that is created by systems that each assign an identity and have decided that that identity trumps all the others. Intersectionality is what happens when a person's own identities for themselves, those multiple, sometimes conflicting truths, when the person can decide what the right balance of identities is at any given point. I want to talk to you about some work the Full Frame Initiative has been doing in California. About 2 years ago, we started a project, maybe 2.5 years ago, bless you, to document how different stakeholders, survivors, practitioners, policymakers, and funders, knowing there's overlap between these groups, how they understand success for survivors of violence. And we started down this road because it turns out that when you do a literature review, as we did, and you look at things even beyond the literature, there is baked into so much of what we have collectively done, which is a lot of good work, but there are baked in assumptions about what success is. Success has something to do with getting safe from an abusive partner, or reducing harm, or danger. And that is what we do first, right? And even if we're moving it beyond the sort of the stuff that's beyond leaving, we still are really focused in on that idea of that's our marker of success, which totally makes sense, by the way, as somebody who's been doing frontline work and now policy work in domestic violence for 25 years. I get it deeply in my heart that people are hurt and people are dying. But we've made some pretty big jumps, and we wanted to find out whether or not that actually is how different stakeholders understand success. And we used a workshop process that I'm happy to share with you. It's not actually about domestic violence. It doesn't ask any questions about domestic violence, and it doesn't ask any questions about services. It, in fact, is exactly the same process we're doing with families in Missouri that have kids in juvenile justice, a bunch of different things. But it's a way of actually having people identify specific moments in their lives when they actually felt successful. We could do it here, if we had the time, okay? Specific moments in their lives that illustrate what it really means to be successful. And then over an hour and a half, we sort of unpeel that. One person called it a positive flashback. We're training people to deconstruct positive moments, which is exactly the opposite of a critical incident review. It's a success moment review. We did this with over 350 people across California. And what we heard is that success is a combination of elements that have both nothing and everything to do with violence. People who've survived violence identify themselves as fulfilling many roles simultaneously: mothers, employees, students, friends, church members, lesbians, activists, gang members, not simply as survivors or victims. They repeatedly define their challenges and successes in the context of their whole lives, with the violence being one, but not the only one, and usually not the most salient or relevant experience. What we actually heard when we did a 4-month, very in-depth, rigorous qualitative analysis using 2 different methodologies with the same data were 4 themes, 2 of which were about connection. One was about being connected to people, and one was about belonging to something bigger than yourself, and the other was about accomplishment, feeling like you had gotten to something that you didn't even think you could get to, and the other was about new opportunities, creating new opportunities for yourself or for your family. Only 7%, and the violence was there, by the way, and the person perpetrating the violence, it's not that anybody was in denial or not talking about that, it was there, but only 7% of the moments, 7% of the moments that survivors shared even were about a change in the relationship with the abusive partner. That's really important for us to know. The other thing that we heard that for me is even more profound is that far more often, we have an entire system that is set up where we help someone address the violence with the idea that you address the violence so that new opportunities can open up to you, right? What we heard far more often were people talking about some shift that they made or that happened external to their relationship. They were able to qualify for a car loan. They graduated from school. They watched a kid who hadn't been, who was born with cerebral palsy actually begin to hold a knife and fork, do some of these things, right? And at those moments, and I'm going to give you some terms for them in a minute, that those moments changed everything. So something changes that then creates the opportunity for change in a relationship. Does that make sense? The change and new opportunity external to the domestic violence is the thing that leads to the change in the relationship with the abusive partner, not the other way around. That is exactly the opposite of what we heard from really amazing practitioners and policymakers and funders. Who, by the way, you'll be shocked to hear, and I say this as somebody who has spent a lot of time with survivors. This is not lambasting people. You may not be that surprised to hear that almost all of the moments from practitioners were about the moment of leaving, a moment of leaving, a moment of taking steps to be safe from that one person. And they were about services. The other thing that we heard was about other people and people's lives. The thing that we've almost never heard about were services. This doesn't mean that services don't matter. It just means that we're not the center of people's lives. And that's really hard to hear unless we can step back enough to say, that's great. That's great. We may be doing something really, really awesome, but that may mean that a person actually has a life outside of us. Which means that there's so much to build on. There's so much that we don't even see, that not because we don't want to, but because so much of our training is about what happens in the confines of our program models. And what happens in those interactions that we have with people, which absolutely can be important and absolutely are transformative. But people grow and change in relationships far more than they do in programs. Survivors in California speak to this fundamentally human tension between the importance of being grounded and having an identity in relationship to others, which is something we've talked about all day, the importance of relationships, and having an identity in relationship to yourself, charting our own course and trajectory. And the context of our work doesn't actually really help us help survivors hold this tension. Because everything we do and all of our training and a lot of our funding points us just to focus on the issue of domestic violence, and therefore the person solely in the context of that issue. And to the extent that we help people chart a course and trajectory, it usually is how they're going to chart a course and trajectory separate from the violence. And put that front and center. And we are left then with this really fundamental divergence in terms of understanding about the centrality of domestic violence in people's lives. It's not an indictment of people in the field. It's not an indictment of all the progress that we have made as a field. It's a commentary on the water that we're swimming in. And it's an opportunity for us to think more broadly about the work that we do. So where do we go from here? Does it mean we stop offering services? No. Does it mean we stop talking about domestic violence? No. But maybe we need to do it in a little bit of a different way, some of which are things that have already been mentioned. So I'm not going to go into great detail here, but what I want to propose is a framework for well-being that helps us tie things together. Because the charge that survivors in California have shared with us, which is the same as the charge that survivors around the country are sharing with us, yes, is to honor that people are doing amazing things to stay safe in relationships, and maybe to leave relationships, but they're also doing a whole lot of other things. To honor people's identities and support well-being. These are 5 domains of well-being: social connectedness, stability, safety, mastery, meaningful access to relevant resources. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about them in a minute. But I want us to just also pay attention to the fact that we may be somewhat, but society as a whole has decided that domestic violence is a safety issue. And when we look at why domestic violence is so pernicious, I think it's not just because it's a safety issue, it's because it actually actively erodes people's assets in all 5 of these domains simultaneously. If domestic violence were only a safety issue, our work would be a lot easier. But we all know that it leaves people isolated and shamed. It leaves people's lives unstable and unpredictable. It erodes people's sense of mastery and power, and it certainly cuts off people's access to food and other things. But what it would mean, this is not a framework for survivors. The framework I'm going to tell you about for a few minutes, and I'll be talking to some more of you about it in greater depth tomorrow, is a framework for all of us. Everything that I'm about to say, whether or not you are a survivor, these are things that every single person needs. These are fundamental human needs, okay? There is no what survivors need. There's just what we need. We all need connectedness, which means not just friendships, but we need people for information and we need people for material support so that when we lose our wallet, we have $10 to get a taxi back to wherever it was. We need information on where the best or safest hotel is to stay in a neighborhood that we haven't been to before. But we also need to give. Most social connectedness just has to do with, and when we're thinking about it in terms of services, we think about who can you rely on. We need to start asking people who relies on you. Because people are relying on survivors all the time and not just their kids. Social connectedness also means having places where we belong, where we feel some sense of belonging. Some of us are fortunate enough to have that sense from our workplace. Maybe it's a faith community, maybe it's the bar. Sometimes it's family. But we all need a tribe or tribes that give us part of our identity. We need to be safe, but a broader definition of safety than we perhaps as a movement have conceptualized. I think we need to start thinking about safety as the ability to be our authentic selves without being at much heightened risk for physical or emotional or mental harm or danger. So when we ask, is that school safe? I'm not talking about, is it physically safe? I'm talking about, is it safe for me and my kid? Maybe. Is it safe for your trans kid who's in a community where that kid is told he's going to go to hell? That's not safe. Are our programs really safe for survivors beyond safety from a batterer? We all need mastery. Mastery is a little bit complicated one. Who remembers learning to ride a bike? Just those guys? Okay, the rest of you have really missed out. Because what you get that first time that you're actually sailing down the road or across the parking lot or wherever it was that you were learning to ride, you got that kick of dopamine, right? And you're like, oh, this is the best, right? That's what a big part of what, it's not the entirety of it, but that's a big part of what mastery is. It's a great big kick of dopamine, and it comes from trying, and we heard this morning in terms of developing resilience, having to try again and again and again at something till you get it and you get better and better at it, and it's something that matters to you and it's something that matters to other people around you. And yes, it's important to be empowered in terms of how you feel about your relationship to the person who's abusing you, but you know what? It's also just really important to feel really awesome as you are the best skateboarder in your neighborhood, or you are really good at math, or I do a lot of work in the juvenile justice system. There are a lot of kids, I will tell you, that get their sense of mastery from being the best in their neighborhood at picking locks, at stealing cars, right? Dealing. And we all need meaningful access to relevant resources, which is not services. Services may be how people get their meaningful access, but a food pantry is not a relevant resource. Food is a relevant resource. And it may be that an awesome food pantry is the best way that someone gets meaningful access, and that's okay. But these are things that we all need. But there's something else about this framework that makes it a little bit different. These are interdependent. It turns out my safety depends a lot on my social connections. Okay? It turns out my mastery really depends on stability and social connections as well. Okay. And with all due respect to Maslow, these 5 domains of well-being are non-hierarchical. We don't get safe first and make friends later. If I am a mom at the end of the month and my benefits are up and I don't have food to feed my kid and money for diapers. If I have social connections, maybe somebody can trade me childcare for a lift to the food pantry, and if I've got some mastery, maybe I can sweet talk my way into some extra food this month, right? Or maybe somebody will lend me something. If I don't have any of, right, et cetera, if I don't have any of those, I'm going to end up having to go back to the guy who was beating the crap out of me, or I'm going to have to sleep with somebody to get some money, or I'm going to have to borrow money from somebody and I'm going to end up owing my entire check to somebody else by the time it arrives. And I'm going to be further behind. So my ability even to get food and things is deeply, deeply intertwined with these other pieces. It doesn't mean that certain domains, safety may not be the main concern. It may be the main concern one day. But if we only attend to safety, what we're doing is we're forcing what we call unsustainable trade-offs for folks. Because when you have things that are interdependent and non-hierarchical, what happens when you pull a rubber band out too far in one direction, right? So think about getting way out in front on safety. We can make change there. And social services in America are really good at helping people make change in any one of these domains, but usually we do it by eroding the assets that people have in the other domains. And making change is really hard for folks, but sustaining change is harder. And if you don't believe it, just ask anybody who has made a fortune betting on the diet industry. The diet industry and many, many other industries in this country are predicated on feeding into, no pun intended, Americans' belief that change is hard and then you steady state. What we have found from community-based organizations across the country is that change that lasts for folks living at the deep end of the deep end is change that, yes, may help people make a shift in one of these domains, but does it by building on assets and minimizing the trade-offs in the other domains. It works in juvenile justice, it works in homelessness, it works in domestic violence, it works in sexual assault, it works with immigration, it works with anything. Because you know what? It's just people. So sometimes people hear this and they say, oh my God, we're burnt out. We're totally maxed out. We're exhausted. We haven't gotten funding raised. Our funding's got, like, we can't. No more. Like, we can do that one domain. Forget it. This is not whatever it takes, right? You can take off your cape. There's a huge difference between whatever it takes and what it takes to help people break cycles of poverty and violence and trauma, whether they're individuals or they're communities. Okay? What it takes is building on assets and minimizing trade-offs among those 5 domains. It's easy to say, yes, it's hard to do, but it doesn't necessarily add to what we do. It changes what we do. It's being applied, and in the interest of time, I'm just going to move forward on this. So let me tell you about some of the places that this framework is being applied to create really huge change, and they're very, very different places. I mentioned our work statewide in California, and that's work that's continuing. In Missouri, the entire juvenile justice system's assessment of kids and families coming into the system statewide, their treatment planning and their community reintegration planning has now been completely revamped to focus on identifying assets and minimizing trade-offs among the 5 domains of well-being, and Medicaid is paying for it as treatment. It has been so successful that we have just been engaged by their child welfare system to also bring a truly well-being framework into that work. And if you want to see domestic violence and sexual assault and the impact on kids, look at child welfare in America. In Massachusetts, it's being used by 4 state agencies: Department of Children and Families, Housing and Community Development, Transitional Assistance, and Public Health. Because our state screws people who are homeless. I say this as someone who lives in Massachusetts. Right now, it's still not safe to be at risk of homelessness and be a survivor of domestic or sexual violence in the state of Massachusetts. You are going to have to pick one of those as your identity. If you have the other one as your identity, you are literally going to be in systems that disqualify you from the other. That is starting to change because this is a framework that is actually getting these stupid systems to stop fighting in their pissing matches about who has dominance over each other to actually put the person at the center. And you know what? It's pretty cool when you sit in a meeting and you have somebody from one state agency look at a policy being written by another state agency and say, we can't do that because people are going to end up more socially isolated. They're talking the same language. These stars, there's nobody from Idaho on here, I'd just like to point out, but I'm sure that there should be and could be. These stars are members of a national domestic and sexual violence cohort, which are right now 10 organizations, amazing DSV organizations from around the country that have come together and said, the folks that are coming in through our door are not coming to us just seeking safety. Going back to that, this is not their only issue, and this is, oh, by the way, we can't just look at their strengths in terms of the domestic violence. They are bringing so much more to us, and we want to reshape our programs and potentially the field around well-being. Everything from assessment to evaluation and what matters in our work with folks. And we also have a cohort of organizations in Greater Boston across 8 disciplines, from homeless runaway youth to the Boston Chinatown Neighborhood Center and everybody in between in terms of who they work with, their target populations, organizations that would never sit at the same table, that are coming together and using these 5 domains of well-being as a common language and to create a common message for policymakers and funders about what it actually takes for people. Not those people or those people or those people, but just people. People and families and communities to actually thrive. I want to just say one thing that I should have said earlier before I wrap up, which is that I mentioned that these are universal for all of us. And the longer I do this, the more I believe that that's true. But how many of us also feel like everybody that we work with is different? If you don't all raise your hands, we've got a real problem. I have news for you. Everybody that you work with is different. Everybody has a different story, right? Everybody comes from a different thing. And how often do we have the experience of, yes, that's fine. Yes, everybody that we work with may be dealing with, whether it's domestic violence or sexual violence or immigration or whatever. But if you really want to understand what we do, let me tell you a story, because they're all so different, and the work we do with each one of them is different when we're doing our best work, right? It doesn't look the same from one person to another, right? Right? Okay. So what having a well-being framework, and certainly this well-being framework, allows us to do is to say that there are these core human needs that are universal to all of us, but what each one of those domains means to each one of us is different. Just like my kid who, at least I don't think, but maybe, isn't trans, may be safe in her school. I'd like to think our school is safe for a trans kid. I don't know, right? But that's true for all of the domains. And it's not just about our personal experience. It's about race and class and history and all of these other things that normally we put sort of off there as sort of background context. When we use a well-being framework and have domains of well-being, what we can do is we can make people's multiple identities and their histories actually part of how they get to define what it means to have your needs met in these domains. Does that make sense? Rather than just deciding even that it's going to be the same for all people that have the same background. So let me close with a few thoughts. I want to invite us to resist the temptation to broaden our lens only in such a way that a survivor of violence is also seen as formerly homeless, in recovery, reunited with children. Instead, I think we need to broaden our lens so that she's a really patient mom, an awesome dancer. She makes the best chicken and rice for miles. Right now, many of you probably do use your private dollars to pay for lots of work that is honoring people's multiple identities and helping them achieve well-being beyond safety. We spend hours in the psychiatric emergency room with a woman being her liaison to a system impenetrable, to those who aren't distracted by trauma, exhaustion. And maybe we visit her several days later to bring her underwear and just say hi. A well-being framework says that's actually the work that matters. That is the work not just of connection, but that is the work of long-term change. It's the work of the world that validates people's identities. So a place to start is rethinking some questions. If you care about strengths and assets, can we please stop asking not what you need? It's an okay question, but we also have to ask some version of what do you have? In Missouri, the third question now on the intake assessment for kids and families is, what are your hopes and dreams? And there's been more than one parent who has broken down and said, heavily system-involved parent, who has literally said, no one has ever asked me this before. I only get asked what I need. When we ask somebody what their hopes and dreams are, we're actually communicating that it actually matters, not just that they're there to be fixed. If we ask, who can you count on? Is there anybody that you can call? Is there somebody that you could go stay with? Can we please start asking also who counts on you? If someone seeks change, let's remember that nothing comes without a side effect and a trade-off. And we need to start asking a question that is central to all of this, making change sustainable, which is a question of, is it worth it? Change is only worth it when we minimize the trade-offs for ourselves or for other people. So the question is, are we ready for a shift? We knew that issue-centered services weren't the answer, and we knew that we have to be survivor-centered. But the question is, are we ready to move from being survivor-centered to people-centered and family-centered and community-centered? It means really explicitly building on assets that we often never see in our anti-violence work because they seem peripheral, but they are the heart and soul of how people see themselves and want to be and what makes them happy. If services are to move from being issue-focused to survivor-focused and people-focused, it also isn't just about what we do individually, which is important. We actually need, collectively, to enable structural change so that we practitioners can focus more systematically on well-being. This is not going to happen if we're trying to do it in the margins, but yet all of our accounting to the feds and everybody else still says these are the only things that actually matter. And we also need to systematically and systemically focus on a survivor's identity outside of being a survivor. That won't deny that identity, I promise you. She knows it's there. We can still talk to her about it. We can still do the work on it. But actually actively inquiring about who are you beyond this? I want to know who else you are, which some of us may do without realizing the importance of that. That may be the most healing thing that we can give. So I started out with an invitation, and I now leave with the same invitation but as a challenge, which is to take the revolutionary step of really redefining the work we do, not as minimizing harms, not as reducing violence, not as reducing danger, not even necessarily as preventing just violence, but of actually increasing well-being throughout our communities, because that is how we get to those other outcomes of reduced violence and danger in ways that actually last. Thank you.